one of the most classic names in heavy metal. A band that could be considered by many to be overrated, some consider them even to be underrated. Mainly because those are folks that don't realize just how much credit that a band like Venom has really been given for various styles of metal, various subgenres. One thing that we never really think about whenever it comes to these guys is that they are still capable of surprise. So from the very depths, their new album here in 2015 definitely came as a surprise to many, including myself. I believe that I had mentioned something about this in my excited releases, or the releases I was excited about for the first quarter of this year, and then completely and totally spaced out, forgetting that I'd even said that. It took a friend to actually remind me that this album was not only available, but for some strange reason, the store I work for didn't get any of it. We're still waiting on it. But from the very depths, let's take a listen to it. Let's examine it a little bit, because at this stage of the game for Venom, there's only two real capabilities. There's only two real things that could really occur. We're not going to get that album of the year style of material that perhaps we would have expected in the 1980s whenever they were really a cornerstone of metal. But we could still get a very unexpected surprise, one that's very, very well tailored and very well done. Or we could get an album that definitely felt like it was going to be a major event, but then really failed to deliver. From the Very Depths is an album that certainly illustrates why this was a group that was so quintessential in the 1980s, to paving the way for various other acts that would follow, because it's one that's able to really maintain just that core idea of heavy metal. Because whenever you think about it, these guys were not a black metal band, these guys weren't a death metal band, these guys weren't evil or a cult. Well, okay, they were a bit of a cult. But this was a group that definitely would not be, by traditional standards, lumped in with the modern-day core of what people consider black metal or death metal. They're definitely not a band that you would really categorize in with either of these two subgenres or any of the other subgenres that they perhaps helped to spawn. Similar into how Hellhammer certainly would not be lumped into the same subgenres as some of the groups and movements that they were able to spawn. They were essentially just a stepping stone for us to get to where that needed to be. So From the Very Depths basically illustrates that by retaining that heavy metal sensibility, by keeping that style. It's almost like listening to a Motorhead album and realizing that that's what heavy metal kind of was in the 1970s and the early 1980s. It was a band that certainly was, comparatively speaking to other groups, against the grain, a little bit different. One that had a lot of core elements in the punk movements, one that definitely had a lot of core elements in just the hard rock movements, and Venom is really no different. They're just a band that took it a little bit further. One that was able to blend some furious soloing with some different subject matter that you wouldn't hear in a hard rock album. From the Very Depths does this as well. All in all, this is an album, like we said, that could fall under two different categories, whether it be a nice surprise or one that just didn't feel like it lived up to the hype and the event of a new Venom album coming out. I actually like the nice surprise idea whenever I listen to From the Very Depths, principally because that's kind of what it was for me before I even listened to the album. But then once I listened to the album, it was, once again, a nice surprise because it's pretty well done. It's an album that it doesn't give you that same sense of, holy shit, what is this going to cause, as perhaps a quintessential album such as black metal. This is definitely not one that's going to be like Welcome to Hell, that perhaps just feels like a band that's welcoming back some of the old evil that it's really kind of brought to the world with some of its classic seminal works. This is instead one, From the Very Depths, this album where it showcases that Venom not only is still here, they're still around, they're still an important name, but they're also still able to write some pretty good music. The album's able to impress in some positions, in some areas. It's not one that's going to impress you completely from the very first notes of the opening track, Eruption, all the way to the very final track on this album. It's instead one that's going to impress you casually from track to track. It's going to be, whether it's going to be some very direct lyricism, either that or if it's going to be a relatively competent solo. It's definitely not going to be one that's going to be for this new slew of metal kids that needs ridiculous time signature changes, or one that requires something that's a little less direct and a little bit more complex. It's not going to be one that's going to impress the deathcore kids, principally because it's not deathcore, and it's not going to be one that's going to really captivate a lot of the people who are on the fringe line of heavy metal, even though this is a band that very much could be considered a fringe line band, one that's simply heavy metal. This should be the type of band that these types of individuals seek out, but it seldomly is. The album is very direct. It's one that's able to really showcase a lot of different things. In the song Rock and Roll is Dead, it definitely kind of feels like this was a song written right after the events that took place last year in 2014, right after hearing what Gene Simmons had said about this, even though the song itself, whenever you listen to the lyrical content, seems as though it has absolutely nothing to do with it. It's kind of a nice coincidence, actually, mainly because Venom is almost saying that rock and roll is dead because of heavy metal. And it's kind of a funny thought, because rock and roll is still alive, and so is heavy metal. Is heavy metal dying? Was heavy metal ever dying? I thought we really proved that it never really was, even in the 1990s where it didn't have a lot of popularity, but is it dying now? These are all phrases that you kind of think about a little bit whenever you see a song title like that. But musically speaking, everything is very competently and well put together. Everything feels like it has that great classic vintage heavy metal styling. This isn't an album that feels overproduced by a long shot. It's definitely not one that feels like it's been fallen victim to that new school idea that louder is better, which is something that's actually plagued a lot of ancient bands, bands from the 80s. If you listen to a recent Exodus album, for example, a band that definitely didn't really need a lot of high-class studio quality in order to produce a kick-ass thrash metal record, 30 years ago, now is getting some of the best production in the bunch. And then you consider a band such as Hell, which eventually transformed into Sabbath, and Andy Sneak being in that band and now also being a producer. Their two albums that have come out, 30 years after their being bore, well, they all sound terrific. The Venom album sounds good, but it doesn't sound like it has that stain of overproduction. And because of that, it still retains kind of a little bit of that classic flavor to it. It definitely gives your palate a little bit of a taste of how things used to be. It's definitely not one that feels like it was recorded inside of a tin can with nothing more to use as a microphone than perhaps a paper towel roll. But this isn't black metal, literally and figuratively. This is instead a group that's, right now, kind of still kicking ass and taking names. They're ones that are able to really write some pretty simple songs, ones that don't necessarily need to assault you with fantastic wordplay. It's one that's still stemming to try to aim to that little occult center of your brain a little bit, and one that's still continuing to kind of assault it directly, as opposed to using a lot of fancy metaphor. As far as the music is concerned, it's direct, and that's kind of what you expect from them. If you're expecting maybe a slower song or a colorful ballad, forget about it. Venom's not that style of band. That's one of the things that caused a lot of people to respect them. This was always music that was direct and in your face, which is what caused a lot of bands after them to adopt a direct and in your face style. Like I said, this isn't going to necessarily blow you away. This isn't a band that we're going to probably talk about in the end of the year list. But at the same time, you never know. It could be a weak year. I would still give this album a 77. 77 out of 100, 7.7 out of 10. It's competent. It's good. It's certainly one that demands a listen. It's certainly one that should be sought out, simply because it's Venom, and they are still able to make some very good music. They're not dead by a long shot, just like heavy metal. But what did you guys think about this album? Did From the Very Depths take you by surprise? Is this news to you? Are you going to your local record store the minute after this video ends to see if you can seek this out? If you're not, that means you already have it, or you don't want it. But you should. This is definitely an album that's worth consuming. So what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. We'll talk later.